life to come on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats, where we are joined by Josh Hayes, Industry Certification Coordinator at Lamar State College Orange. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it since we met back in, I guess, Fort Worth a few months ago.
Yes, sir. And for anybody who's watching this, get ready because Josh is gonna, I think, inspire you the way he's already exciting and inspiring me. Josh, with your work at Lamar State College Orange, I think to your point, we met several months ago, and it was around these notions of, embedded credentials. But I also, right before we went live, you were talking about, yeah, there's embedded, there's buzzwords, but we're also kind of contextualizing this within like just a historic moment, I think was your word. So maybe let's kick off just like with that kind of blue sky thinking and tell us about how you're thinking about this stuff as a historic moment.
Also, as I was saying, what's historic about this is really a convergence of themes. So you have at the national level from this administration, it's been building for years with the Jobs Act that shorter term investments were more strategic, they were more portable for people. And we what we needed to do was to develop awareness, especially within institutions that are relatively slow to change. How do we deploy high value credentials within the context of our kind of traditional college? So that is combined with the advent of AI. I'm not speaking of AI as a content area. I'm speaking it as a tool, and it serves a couple of different tools in my work. But it functions really well as a thought partner. And so when you're looking at trying to connect these things, for me, my problem was I worked at an existing institution, have probably a dozen different fields with various certificates and associate's degrees. And I'm a reading teacher by training. Worked in adult education and ESL for about 20 years or so. This is my first kind of like dedicated curriculum work, but I've done a lot of back mapping. I've done a lot of credential alignment, but I've never done it with tools, right? So we started looking into it, and I realized that there were that with AI, and I want to speak more about the math and the project in more detail, but that it just gave me a computational power that a civilian just doesn't normally have access to. I'm working at a small school and on the Texas-Louisiana state line, and I can sit down and execute 718 dimensional semantic space and measure vector cosine alignment at my desk on a standard GPU. These are not things that were possible 3 years ago. So I think it's one of these things that we have a really wonderful way of finding meaning within the standards, and that meaning existing within our own student learning outcomes within legacy courses and finding the best match. Sometimes that means it's a great match and it's ready to run. Sometimes SMEs need to do some modifications to ensure that we're covering modern content. But the fact is that in the state of Texas, especially at the lower division level, we have kind of standard SLOs for the vast majority of all courses for intertransferability, and this is public documentation. So when I looked at that, if you're looking at a full cold start, that's 18,000 unique courses offered at hundreds of institutions, representing 17,000 individual student learning outcomes. That's a bit much to kind of jump out of the gate with a new certification and say, hey, you guy teaching 15 hours this fall, why don't you go ahead and pick a third party credential for this? So what we're able to do is to provide high likelihood matches so that we don't waste SME's time while we still get very, very defensible chain of evidence in how we made that decision.
And you just covered so much stuff there, Josh, and I just love it. And also, this feels so big and so insurmountable and so scary. And like we're hearing that one person, at Lamar State College Orange, in a pretty short amount of time was able to come up with like some pretty, reliable and big at scale stuff for those subject matter experts to be able to then, validate. But just taking a quick step back, one of the things I hear you describing is change management. And that, okay, we're sensing this urgency with this, historic moment we're in, but also we don't need, that doesn't mean we need to rush for 100% new things. I hear you're saying that your change management is really anchored in what do we already have that's familiar, that's working, that doesn't need to be thrown away? And how do we sync up the new and embed it within the old as a way of, maybe just doing change management and making decisions that stay made.
I think that's, when you work in a system such as us, we have some boilerplate student learning outcomes that are tied to an individual kind of course record that obviously you're going to have a variety of deployment and how that looks at different institutions. It's the whole reason we have multiple institutions. So, yeah, I mean, it should have its own flavor. So the way that a course and the way a welding 1 year certificate won't have the same courses in it one college to the next throughout the state. At the same time, you may have, say, in the systems office, say, look, we would really like to see what you're doing for credentials. Can we see, can we do the work for NCCER? 10 years ago, to do like a full NCCER module implementation across a 1 year degree, that would have taken, at least a semester, probably closer to 7 months before it was ready to submit to a SME for review, to submit to a committee to do. But at the same time, I realized as I was looking at these, I was like, well, what was the reason I submitted that? Like, how did I make that decision? I don't know anything about HVAC. I don't know that much about welding. I grew up in Texas, so I know a lot about air conditioning. But I don't know a whole lot about process operations, despite growing up in a refinery town. So, what was my justification for starting the process down the road? And I had remembered as an undergraduate at the University of Texas, I had a linguistic professor that sat us, this is in the 90s, sat us down and had us hand compute what's called a Jacquard correlation. And it's essentially a percentage calculation of exact terms. So you got two passages and you calculate how much of those are the same. And so I remember that. And so I asked AI about it. It started this kind of long conversation about how had things changed in terms of semantic measurement and mapping. And that's when I fell upon some of the more sophisticated machine learning and realized that GitHub is a library and this code is written. What I didn't understand was how to put it together. And so that's really where it started, looking for measures that could give me objective coherence between two unknowns, and that I could present that and articulate to subject matter experts why we got to that decision. So then if you have 20 standards and 20 classes, it's not 4,000 permutations. Now you're looking at 30 reviews.
I mean, you just, yeah, to go from, I think you had a number in the 17,000s, a few minutes ago to 30, that all of a sudden, yeah, the temperature in the room goes down a little bit.
Way down. It goes way down. And it can be, what's beautiful is once I realized that I could build this in a Python workflow in SharePoint, that means that I can take the results from this and have automatic surveys. So each time a run goes, it'll automatically go to my SME pool, survey them on a Likert scale for approval, and the data comes back and proves its validation simultaneously while doing the SME approval. So this is very scalable. Even on a desktop computer, you could easily, I'm running maybe a tenth of what the computational requirement would be. You don't need anything like a Gen AI compute stack to pull this off. You can do this on Python on a desktop.
And, Josh, one of the things that you talked about earlier is that you use the word portable. And so, I like when I hear that word, I think about mobility and I think about, that the credential is not just about offering programming and credentialing the programming. That when you use a word like portable, I'm imagining that there's a whole lot more involved in the credential life cycle as far as how you expect learners to be able to enter into a program and how they're using their credential after they successfully complete the program.
I mean, I do. I mean, I work at an institution of higher education. So when I look at portability, I look at, two things. One, is in general, can they use it around the community and outside the community? Like whatever your geo fence is for marketing, people will move outside that. So what is the general market for such a credential? Both based on the skills and based on the credential's identity itself. This is unrelated to this, but I've done some labor market analysis where we can actually disaggregate the value of a certificate of a credential from a bachelor's degree that carries it, and I can tell you that the majority of the signal comes from the credential, not from the degree. So the wage signal is strongest on the more specific things that you can identify. So the value is macroeconomically, econometrically, it's there. It's what do we do now that they exist? And I think what I've stumbled upon is a student learning objective, granular mathematical approach for coherence. Gives us a good indication of should this be reviewed. But I'm doing it for standards and legacy curriculum. There's simply no reason why the same process with a well-designed validation couldn't drastically accelerate a student's interest uh, in getting prior learning assessment for work activities, or as you're pointing out, carrying in, receiving the industry credential and counting how does that count towards our credit courses. Well, in this scenario, if we know what the correlation is to, say, an NCCR level one set of modules, we already know what SLOs within the existing classes they've achieved and which ones that we don't have evidence. Because this is an epistemological activity. We're looking for what evidence we have and then going through a human confirmation. So
So
you could use this for PLA.
and because I am going to have to look up some words after this for definitions, am I understanding in some ways it's clarity on the institution side of what credentials are credentialing, as well as confidence that of what a credential earner has earned and what they've
That
demonstrated.
and what's happened in like with my work as this progresses is that I'm realizing that for years, we've had kind of open conversations and even emailed syllabi across the country to see if the English classes lined up. Um, we can short circuit that a lot. And I'm not an advocate of of the Frankenstein PLA, but by identifying which objectives are already met, you've really clasped your gap in evidence. So what you're trying to prove for equivalency is much reduced. Each step of this and the iteration of application, it's all I can see it do is it simply reduces the cognitive load on very busy people. It's we're making the same decision, but we're making it much more efficiently. And we can justify it externally. It's not that, the admissions advisor with a degree in geology decided that somebody in an economics class should get this. How do they decide it? Well, they have three different semantic measures that cleared a pathway for them to refer it for final review in a discrete way to uh, the SME, to the faculty member that might review it. That process can take weeks. We're talking you can do this in probably 20 minutes.
And
And by doing
amazing.
SLO analysis, it means that I may want to apply that prior learning experience to a particular class based on a particular measure, a particular major. So I see this all the time with military transfers. They come in and they get credit in general. However, did we go down and do the semantic analysis and decide what exact class might meet an exact? Because a lot of times the PLA gets done prior to the major being applied on top. So we're not doing it in the context of the major, we're doing it in the context of the catalog. I can short circuit that.
And then like my mind also goes to places, Josh, whether you're doing now or if it's on your roadmap, that this has implications to advising conversations, that an advisor, you know, can have a one pager about the student they're about to meet with that's going to supercharge that conversation so that they can way more effectively support that student's success. I'm also wondering, something when you were talking about the sort of down the road outcomes that we can correlate to specific SLOs. In certain states, like I'm pretty sure in Texas is one of the states where they're starting to look at funding, models that relate to is this program, beneficial to people's employment outcomes. Do you foresee a world where faculty actually come to you to say, are there some SLOs that would make logical sense for me to be incorporating into my academic program in order for me to be more relevant and more aligned with earnings outcomes so that, you know, just a funding play?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know that the mathematical models that I'm using, and I mean, before we leave, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I don't know that they're absolutely appropriate for the specific ones are. I think conceptually, yes, that's where we're heading. There's two big studies that have been done with similar context in math. And one was a large correlation study done by ONET and ESCO to correlate the European classification system of occupations to the ONET classification of occupations, and they used a sentence embedding K like top ranked reviewed, and they got like a 95% correlation on top wins. And they were doing top 10. I'm trying to do top three. And Amazon Web Services has a program that does use a combination of deterministic sentence embedding and Gen AI to do what's called a latent object modeling. And that's where we look at the math and we say, these student learning outcomes are similar to one another and are around a core competency. We can describe its shape geometrically, but we don't necessarily know exactly what's inside. But when we're looking for, when the AWS system looks for correlations, it says, look, this is correlated to this cluster. Now, what do you want me to compare it to? Is it social studies? Is it language? So I think that these things were going to be the norm. What I think is wonderful about what I've been able to accomplish at LSEO is that this is just a guy with with AI access, free AI access, and a desktop, and my reliability competes with the Department of Labor and the European Union. So I'm cool with the math. You know, I feel like we're gonna that this is a real big pivot in terms of capacity.
Very cool. Well, I know we're just down to probably our last minute or two here, so maybe you said that there was something specific around the math that you did want to do, and so let's maybe close with that.
So really, I'm using just for people that might be putting their fingers to this. I'm using sentence transformers, and that gives me an idea of the general category. Like, what is this sentence about? It's similar, how much to another sentence, but it can handle things like synonyms and that sort of thing. Then I use a term frequency and inverse document frequency, where I look at, and my inverse document is the entire corpus of Texas. So now I see what's special about that class in Texas and how close the standard is within the comparison of Texas specifically. And then my last one is a Jacquard correlation, looking between the two of them. If something clears high on all of those, it's literally identical text almost. So the Jacquard, the last one, really just helps me prevent false positives. So if it's a welding class and it's about GMOV welding, stick welding, and it doesn't have any shared vocabulary, that's probably a bad match. So yeah, so like I use a multi-phase machine learning system, whereas a lot of these other ones just they deal with either hand it off to Gen AI, or they use a very heavy SME review period. I'm trying to avoid both of those and give something that's discrete, actionable. And what's nice about the way that I've done it, and I did have to stop, back up, and restart, is that now I've kept complete JSON modification files on all my code. I have a data manual that we maintain. So once this first review gets finished, then I would literally be able to send it to you on a zip drive.
Wow, so and you were able to start with the library of GitHub and finding other people's code, and soon enough, people will be able to go on GitHub and find yours. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's so great.
these are these smell like expensive tools. What they are, you just have to have discipline, and you have to be intentional, and you have to put down your arrogance, because the numbers say what the numbers say, and it's for the SMEs to decide. This stuff that you everybody uses this background of BERT, the sentence transformer, every time you touch an AI. So this is just the front end logic on that, encoding it for a different kind of analysis. So all of these things have grown up together. The policy has converged at the exact same time, and we just have tools that haven't been divided. But I think it should make administrators and registrars that have to communicate with them about how we do this is that we have access to a granular level of data that's never been available. Like there are some things that I attempted to do early in this process where I literally had things come back, like my design, looking at my design in AI, and it would come back and say that their data reply is not human interpretable. I was like, okay, well, that's my first, if we got 32 billion responses, I've got to figure out. So that was the whole process of like pouring it down, but all the tools were available and free.
Man, well, Josh Hayes, thank you so much for sharing just your journey and your story with us here on AACRAO's Credential Chats. He's the Industry Certification Coordinator at Lamar State College Orange. And Josh, okay to give your email in case people want to reach out?
Oh, absolutely.
It's
Fantastic. I'd love to hear some details.
joshua.hayes@lsco.edu. And we really appreciate you sharing with us this week.
Yeah, and I'll keep you in the loop. But thanks for everything, Noah. Thanks to AACRAO. Appreciate it all.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a badge-worthy week. Until next time, so long.